Hi, my name is Jim Toot, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Central Virginia Community College. In this video, we'll discuss the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was a gathering of delegates from 12 of the 13 states who met in Philadelphia from June to September of 1787. Originally authorized by the Continental Congress to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation, they ultimately drafted the Constitution that replaced it. The delegates were not representative of the American people. They were well-educated property owners, many of them wealthy, who came from prosperous seaboard cities, including Boston and New York. Most had served in the Continental Congress and were sensitive to the problems faced by the United States. Few delegates had political careers in the states, and so they were free to break with existing presumptions about how government should be organized in America. James Madison drafted the first working proposal for a constitution and took copious notes at the convention. Published after his death in 1836, they are the best historical source of the debates. They reveal the extraordinary political complexity of the deliberations and provide remarkable insight into what the founders had in mind. The Constitutional Convention responded to ideas, not just interests. Delegates doubted that the people could wisely rule. They sought to replace democracy with a republic in which officials would be chosen to act on the people's behalf. Federalist 10 makes the case. Madison was concerned with threats to order and stability from what he called factions, groups pursuing their self-interest above the public good. For Madison, factions were inevitable. His worst nightmare was of a faction becoming a political majority, trampling on the rights of its helpless opponents, and quickly enacting its program. He favored a large republic, which he believed would discourage a faction's rise to power. Madison expected that in a republic, the number of locally oriented interests would increase and diversify, which would make it harder for any one of them to dominate. Minority factions could pass legislation by forming temporary majorities, Madison reasoned, but these diverse majorities would not be able to agree on a single project long enough to be oppressive. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention first gathered on May 25, 1787, in what is now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Their goal was to devise a constitution, a system of fundamental laws and principles outlining the nature and functions of the government. George Washington presided. Delegates worked in an intimate setting without committees. The structure of power created by the Constitution in Philadelphia resulted from a deeply political process. Political scientists have revealed the degree to which the Constitutional Convention and the ratification conventions can be understood. They were the result of manipulation of parliamentary rules, strategic voting, shifting coalitions, and the agenda setting and framing use of mass communication. Deliberations took place in secret as delegates did not want the press and the public to know the details of what they were considering. Newspapers hardly mentioned the convention at all, and when they did, it was a vague reference praising the high caliber of the delegates. During the Constitutional Convention, there were several cross-cutting divides: large states versus small states. The term large state and small state are misleading. Some small states had larger populations than large states. The small states all shared economic vulnerability and an inability to grow, usually because they were boxed in by other states on their western edge, which made it impossible to hope for westward expansion. Cosmopolitan or centrally located states, Connecticut to Virginia, versus parochial states on the northern and southern borders. And finally, southern states relying on slavery in their economies versus northern states which were not. Large states fired the first salvo. The Virginia Plan, drafted by Madison, foresaw a strong national government that could veto any state laws it deemed contrary to the national interest. The central institution was a bicameral or two-chamber legislature. The people would elect the lower house, which would in turn select the members of the upper house. The two chambers together would then elect an executive and a judiciary. Breaking with the Articles of Confederation equal representation of the states, the Virginia Plan allotted seats to both chambers of the legislature by population size alone. Cosmopolitan or centrally located states provided strong initial support for the Virginia Plan against scattered opposition from the border states. But Madison could not hold this coalition for both a strong national government and a legislature allocated by population. Delegates from the small states of New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland liked a strong national government, but they feared being overpowered. Delegates from populous Massachusetts and 3 fast-growing southern states joined the 2 largest states, Virginia and Pennsylvania, to support legislative districts based on population, but they disliked the Virginia plan's sweeping powers for the national government. On June 15th, the small states proposed an alternative. The New Jersey plan enhanced the national government's powers to levy taxes and regulate commerce, but left remaining powers to the states. The plan had a federal executive elected by the legislature to enforce states' compliance with national law, and a federal judiciary to settle disputes among the states and between the states and the national government. Any national law would become the supreme law of the respective states. The New Jersey plan preserved the core of the Articles of Confederation, equal representation of the states, in a unicameral or single-chamber legislature. The Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, was adopted by the convention with only Virginia and Pennsylvania in opposition. Thus, the configuration of today's Congress emerged not so much from principled deliberations between the Constitution's founders, as from the necessity for compromise between competing state interests. In essence, the founders decided to split the difference. Then, North versus South displaced the divide between the large and the small states. The convention became preoccupied by how the new government would be empowered to deal with slavery. Northerners feared the South's growth and room for expansion. Southerners worried that the North would threaten the practice of slavery, which, although legal in all states, was a central part of only the Southern economies. Northern interest in a strong national government exceeded the Southern demands on slavery. Southerners argued that slaves should be counted when allocating legislative seats. Eventually, the convention settled on a 3/5 clause. 60% of the enslaved population would be counted for the purposes of representation. Northern delegates, convinced that the largest slaveholding states would never have a majority in the Senate, gave in. As the convention considered the national government's powers, an alliance of delegates from New England and the Deep South emerged to defend local control and their state's economic self-interest. Southerners sought to maintain slavery, while New Englanders wanted national tariffs to protect their commerce. They struck a deal that resulted in New England delegates voting to require the return of fugitive slaves and to prevent Congress from regulating the slave trade until 1808. The delegates did not confront slavery head-on. Indeed, the word slavery is not directly mentioned in the Constitution. As a result, the issue of slavery would overshadow much of federal politics until its bloody resolution in the Civil War. The convention's final sticking point was the nature of the executive. The debate focused on how many people would be president, the power of the office, the term of the office, how presidents would be elected, and whether they could serve multiple terms. To break the logjam on the presidency, the convention created the Electoral College as a method of electing the president, a political solution that gave something to each of the state-based interests. The president would not be elected directly by popular vote of the citizens. Instead, electors chosen by state legislatures would vote for president. Small states got more electoral votes than warranted by population, as the number of electors is equal to the total of representatives and senators. If the Electoral College did not produce a majority result, the president would be chosen by the popularly elected House, but with 1 vote per state delegation. In the next video, we will discuss the constitutional ratification debates.